Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about our first segment of the Great Depression, which is causes of the Great Depression. So, fresh off the minor recession that followed the Great War, the American economy began to see growth. Located in Lower Manhattan, in New York City, is Wall Street and the New York Stock Exchange. And the stock exchange is a place where stock shares or part ownership of a company are traded. There are two descriptive phrases that can tell Americans how the stock market is doing: a bear market and a bull market. A bear market is when there are prolonged price declines on the value of stocks, and the bull market is when there's a period of rising stock values. During the Roaring Twenties, the stock market was a bull market. Many people began to purchase stocks and cause stock prices to rise rapidly. The majority of the stock traders could not afford the full value of the stock and would purchase the stocks using margin or credit, a type of credit. Remember that buying on margin meant that you can only pay for a portion of the stock up front, and you would wait until the value of the stock increased to sell it, and then you would make a profit. This allowed the total value of the stock exchange to increase from about $25 million in the mid-1920s to nearly $87 million by September in 1929. Many Americans refused to consider what would happen if the stock market went from a bull market to a bear market. What effect would this have on stocks that were purchased on margin? Well, in the summer of 1929, stock prices peaked or reached the top of their value, and after you reach the top, there is only one way to go, and that is down. Stock prices began to drop. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, traders started a massive sell-off of stocks. Frightened investors rushed to sell their stocks in order to pay off their loan debt from buying on margin, and within 3 hours, the stock market had lost $11 billion in value, or roughly about 12.5% of its value. Investors like J.P. Morgan began to purchase huge amounts of stock to try and offset the selling spree, but to no avail. On Monday, October 28th, stock prices dropped nearly another 13%, and on Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. This set off the worst depression in United States history. So many traders were selling their stocks, and no one was interested in buying them, causing stock prices to collapse. Many believe that it was this stock market crash that was the first main event in a string of events that caused the Great Depression. The day the stock market crashed was given the nickname Black Tuesday. By mid-November 1929, the market lost over $30 billion in stock prices, nearly 40% of its value. Now, what was this margin error? As investors sat back and attempted to figure out reasons for the collapse, the practice of buying on margin became a suspect. How was the market able to grow so fast and fall even faster? Buying on margin. Margin buying fueled the rapid expansion of the market. Purchasing a stock on margin allowed the investor to borrow money, kind of like credit, to purchase a large amount of stock by paying only a fraction of the value up front. Sometimes the buyer was able to borrow up to 75% of the stock value, meaning the buyer needed to only pay or put down 25% up front. The stockholder would wait for the price of the stock to increase and sell the stock when a profit could be made after paying off the remainder of the value borrowed. Here's an example. Let's say Sela wanted to buy a stock in Sela Social Studies, so he borrowed $25 to purchase $100 worth of stock, which means that he borrowed the remaining $75. When the stock value increased to $200, Sela sold his stock. He collected the $200, but paid back the $75 that he borrowed originally to purchase this stock, resulting in a gain of $100. He spent $25 up front, but ended with $125. Not too bad. This was the trend throughout the 1920s. Now let's look at the same scenario, but on October 29th, 1929. Sela wanted to buy stock in Sela Social Studies. He had $25 to purchase $100 worth of stock, which means that he borrowed the remaining $75. Because of massive sell-offs, Sela Social Studies stock plummeted to $1 a share. Sela tried to sell his stock, but he only got $1 in return. He still needed to pay back the $75 that he borrowed to pay off the original purchase. And that is bad. That was a common scene on Black Tuesday when stocks were sold and so many Americans could not pay off the stock and billions of dollars were lost. So what type of effect would that have on the banks? The stock market crash set off a chain of events that would go on and affect the nation and the world as a whole. Millions of Americans could not foresee the decade of depression that would come from a few bad days in the market. After all, nearly 90% of Americans didn't even own any stock. Nearly 5 million urbanites felt the pressure, and soon after, so did the banks. A huge banking crisis shook the economy after the stock market crash. Banks lost heavily on their investments as people were unable to pay back their loans from buying stocks on margin. The American public were fraught with fear and uncertainty and began mass hysteria. Customers quickly navigated the busy streets, rushed to their banks, and withdrew all of their savings to pay off the remaining balance on their stocks in such large numbers that many banks ran out of money. As an effect of the wave of withdrawals, many banks went out of business. What would happen to the people who were waiting so long in line that when they got to the bank they were out of money? Bad news. Customers who had deposited their savings in those banks lost everything and could not go to another bank to withdraw money like today. This was because in the 1920s there was no federal insurance on money that was deposited in banks. People were left with nothing. The bad times continued into the 1930s and in 1931 when over 2,000 banks closed in 1 year. What about the stock market crash and its effect on businesses? Millions of Americans lost nearly everything, and that had a rippling effect on businesses. Many small business owners lost all of their savings and were forced to close. When consumers have no money, they can't spend money, leading to a large number of businesses to cut back production, which resulted in loss of jobs and a rising unemployment. Unemployment would quickly soar to over 4 million laborers out of work. So how was North Carolina, our state? North Carolina was affected by the Great Depression just like anyone else. Mass unemployment had become increasingly widespread across the state, and by 1933, farm income was nearly 50% of its roaring 20s peak. The same year, roughly 30 out of every 100 North Carolinians were on some sort of form of relief. Manufacturing decreased by more than 50% between 1930 and 1933, with economic value dropping from $1.4 billion to $800 million, and the textile and cotton industries' labor wages declined by 25%. Across the state, falling wages and unemployment caused great unrest. Was there a natural cause for the Great Depression? Well, yes and no. A natural business cause of the Depression was the business cycle. The business cycle is a living and breathing entity. It can also be a large contributor as to why the Great Depression was so great. It naturally controls the expansion and contraction of production. It frequently ebbs and flows from prosperity to problems. The Great Depression was an example of the problem. At the bottom of the business cycle, there lies a problem of overproduction and underconsumption at the same time. This period is known as the trough. It's when the supply of a product greatly outnumbers the demand, and there's a huge surplus of supplies and goods sitting on the shelves of stores or in warehouses. Overproduction occurred because during the Roaring '20s, Americans were purchasing household goods at such a rapid rate, and when the Depression hit, the companies continued to produce, but all the consumers did not want to continue to buy, creating a surplus of stock and supplies. So here is a quick little picture of the business cycle. And when we talk about black and red, we're talking about positive and negative in the stock market, in business. I know you've heard of Black Friday after Thanksgiving, and this is where it gets its name from, where businesses usually go into the black, which is the good part of consumerism and the business cycle. So you have businesses and consumerism hits its peak. And then after it hits its peak, it starts to decline. Overproduction halts factory surplus of goods. Workers lose jobs. People buy less. And it hits a trough at the bottom. But then after it hits the bottom, people start buying these surplus goods. Companies would increase production. Workers are rehired. Unemployment drops until it again reaches its peak, and consumerism and people purchasing power reaches its peak. And then it goes back down to this overproduction, a halting factory, surplus of goods, workers lose jobs, people buy less. And it's just a cycle, a continuous cycle of ups and downs. So under the consumption or non-purchase of the goods related to millions of dollars sitting on shelves, not making any money, there was a huge uneven distribution of wealth where millions of Americans did not make enough money to purchase new products. When the trough gets prolonged in the business cycle, unemployment or the loss of jobs goes up. Businesses are unable to pay their employees if they do not sell their product. During the Great Depression, unemployment skyrocketed to 25%, meaning roughly 1 out of every 4 Americans were out of work. The United States was not the only country to be affected by the Depression. There was a sharp decline in world trade. Europe was still recovering from World War I and could not afford to purchase American goods or pay the high tariffs required to sell their goods to the U.S. Germany's whole economy was dependent on the success of the United States, and when our economy tanked, so did nearly everyone else's. All right, guys, we'll see you next time when we talk about the second installment of the Great Depression, Hoover's Response. I'll see you next time.